I know that every time I talk about a place in North Carolina, I say it's one of my favorite places. Well, that's just the way it is, and that's just the way I am. That's why today I'm going to tell you about one of my favorite places in North Carolina. Some people call it the Grand Canyon of the East. Some people call it the Grand Canyon of North Carolina. I recently saw it referred to as the crown jewel of the Blue Ridge, but everybody knows this place as the Linville Gorge. Welcome to episode 87 of the NC Everything podcast. I'm your host Curtis, and this is the weekly show where I talk about everything that has anything to do with North Carolina. I'm pretty excited about today's episode. I've been wanting to cover it for a while. It's one of those places that I love the most but get to visit the least. I think I've been maybe 3 times, but we'll get into the gorge in just a minute. First, I want to thank all of you for tuning in today, or whenever you're watching. I've been looking at the numbers, and the last episode on Vince McMahon, in my timeline, in my world, it came out yesterday. And overnight, I already had probably 30 views. I think it was 30 views this morning. And maybe for a lot of people, that doesn't sound like a lot. But for me, that's pretty impressive. That's jumped a lot over the past, I'd say, 3-4 months. And I can't tell you how good it makes me feel to get up 24 hours later and see that kind of change in the numbers. When I started this thing, it never was my goal to get rich off my podcast or my YouTube channel. I just wanted to get North Carolina out to as many people as I could because I love this state and I want to force people to love it with me. Now, there's about 10 million people in North Carolina, and I had said one time if I could reach a quarter of them, I'd be happy. If I could reach half of them, that would be amazing. And if I could reach all 10 million of you, that would make me ecstatic, but I'd start wondering what everybody's doing with their lives if 10 million people are listening to my little YouTube channel and podcast. But I would appreciate it nonetheless. So again, thank all of you for listening, for watching, for coming back. And if this is your first time on the NC Everything podcast, thank you for giving me a try. I hope I don't let you down. Now, for those of you who don't know, I'm recording for the podcast and the YouTube at the same time. Some of you can see, some of you are only listening. Now, if you're watching, you can see that my co-host Charlie is here with me. And if you're only listening, Charlie is the neighborhood cat. He kind of belongs to everybody. But don't worry, he's not too disruptive. Well, he can be really disruptive, but he's not too vocal. He don't make a whole lot of noise. All right, well, I'm about ready to get into it. Let me just go ahead and say that if you like the show, you can go to www.thenceverythingpodcast.com, and there you can listen to all my past episodes. And there's a link there, and there's a link in the description for my YouTube channel. And there's a handful of YouTube episodes out so far. They're building every week, obviously. But there's a whole lot more of just the audio-only episodes. And if while you're listening, you like the show, or you just want to take pity on me, you can subscribe, rate, and review. And that's what helps me reach more people when they're out there searching for something to listen to. And if you're coming back for the 87th time, if you're coming back for the 87th time, you know I'll go over all that stuff again at the end. But let's go ahead and start talking about Linville. The first thing I want to tell you about Linville Gorge is that it isn't just this big canyon in the mountains. It looks that way, but you got the Linville River, you got Linville Falls, and there's a few cool places all around the gorge, inside and on top of it. And the whole thing is enclosed in Pisgah National Forest. So yes, I'm going to tell you about the gorge, but I want to tell you about all this other stuff around the gorge too. So let's go ahead and jump into the history of the gorge. First and foremost, where is Linville Gorge? Well, Linville Gorge is in the northwestern corner of Burke County. Or if you're coming from the other side, it's just over the county line in the northeastern corner of McDowell County. Now, let's do the origin story. It actually starts 1 billion years ago. And back then, there wasn't a whole lot here but a bunch of molten rock. Well, that molten rock turns into what they call Precambrian granitic quartzites. And those quartzites, that's what makes up the Blue Ridge Mountains. Now, a lot of you might be thinking a billion years ago. I'm just making those numbers up. Nobody can count out a billion years. Actually, I don't know if anybody can count out a billion years. But the Blue Ridge Mountain area, that's arguably the second oldest mountain in the world. Now, I say that it's arguably the second because right now the consensus is that Barberton Greenstone Belt, or the Barberton Greenstone Belt in South Africa, is the oldest mountain range on Earth at 3.6 billion years old. And then the Blue Ridge Mountains comes in second. But over the years, there's been some debate whether or not the Blue Ridge is actually the oldest. And I read somewhere at one time that I guess a billion years ago, or a long, long time ago, the Blue Ridge Mountains were actually far higher than the Rockies are today. But unfortunately, these mountains, they don't come with a birth certificate, or if they did, it's been lost somewhere over the past billion years. So we have to leave it up to the scientists to decide what's the oldest. But even if the Blue Ridge is the second oldest, that's pretty cool. Anyway, you got the Blue Ridge, and they're higher than the Rockies are today. And over a billion years, the mountains, they erode down lower and lower, and you're left with this Precambrian granitite quartzites. And that's just because that stuff is pretty hard and pretty everlasting. And so the final result is the Linville Gorge. Now let's jump forward to 10,000 years ago. That's when the Cherokee people moved into the Linville Gorge area. And they called it Easy O, or Easy Og. Anyway, it meant the river of cliffs. Well, for millennia, the Cherokee thrived here. They fished the river, they hunted the forest. Now, it said during the winters they would migrate down to the lower lands to get away from the conditions up in the mountains. So the Linville area was kind of a summer home to the Cherokee. And one thing I want to insert here is that if you look up the Cherokee territory, it wasn't all just in North Carolina. In fact, North Carolina was kind of the far eastern edge of the Cherokee territory. Their actual territory went all the way to the Mississippi River. But anyway, the Cherokee, they're doing great. Everything's fine and dandy. But then in 1545, the Europeans showed up. More specifically, a guy named Hernando de Soto. Now, you might be thinking, no, it was Sir Walter Raleigh. But actually, the Spanish were exploring the southern U.S. long before the English showed up. Well, after De Soto came Juan Pardo. And then there was the French, and finally the English showed up. And there's two facts about the relationship between Native Americans and the Europeans. Fact number one, the Europeans were kind of hoping that the natives would just kind of get out of the way and let us have what we want. And on their way out, they would give us all that gold and stuff that they've been squirreling away for all these years. And I'm not sure why all the Europeans thought that the Native Americans had these gold stores just everywhere. I mean, to an indigenous person, gold is useless, and so that makes it worthless. But anyway, fact number two, the natives didn't want to get off their land, and they didn't have any gold. But what they did have was a ton of weapons. And they didn't mind using these weapons if they had to. And that's exactly what happened in 1766 in the Linville Gorge. One day, in 1766, William Linville and his son John were hunting along the river. And right now I'm just going to call it the river. It's not called the Linville River just yet. So William and John, they're hunting along the river, and they also brought their servant with them. Now his name was John Williams. So you got William, John, and John, and they're going along the river. Well, at some point, William, John, and John, they run into a Cherokee hunting party. Well, a fight breaks out, and William and John are killed, the father and the son. The servant is the lone survivor. And that's how we know this story today. Well, in honor of the Linville boys who died there, they named the river the Linville River. Now, 11 years later, in 1777, an all-out war would break out between the settlers and the Cherokee. And what made it worse, this was right at the beginning of our Revolutionary War. Now, I'm probably going to cover the Cherokee War of 1777 eventually, but right now, I'll just jump to the end and say that the Cherokee finally gave up the Linville Gorge area. And that was mostly because of Colonel Waitstill Avery and General Griffith Rutherford. Well, after the Cherokee War of 1777, Colonel Avery was the new owner of the Linville area. And I say the Linville area because I don't know exactly how much of what we call the Linville Gorge today that he actually owned. But if I go by most land ownerships back then, it was probably several thousand acres. But Colonel Avery is the owner, and he starts passing that land down through the generations. And it wasn't too many generations because another war was right around the corner. And that's, of course, the Civil War. Now I know that every time I go through a long-term history of North Carolina, the Civil War is going to pop up, and so is the Revolutionary War and all that stuff. Just like a lot of other key points in the nation's history and our state's history. But at least you know it's coming, and sometimes it has a bigger effect on the story, and sometimes not. I'm not going to stay on it too much for this episode. But the Civil War breaks out, and one resource they needed, probably more than anything else during the war, was iron. And that's because back then, iron is what they used to kill each other with. And because we're up in the mountains, naturally, the Confederates started mining iron and forging iron in the Linville area. So they took iron from the Cranberry Mine, which wasn't too far away, and then they were forging the iron at an iron forge that was built just upstream from Linville Falls on the Linville River. The problem is, if you don't want the enemy to find you, you need to keep kind of a low profile. And iron mining and iron forging isn't a really good way to keep a low profile. So that iron operation didn't last too long before the Federal Army came in and they took over that business. But that wasn't the end of mining in the Linville area. The war ends in 1865, and then more mining companies came in along with logging companies. So they started stripping the land of resources, but you need a way to move those resources, and the best way is by rail. And so by the late 1890s, the Western North Carolina Railroad line was up and running. Now let's talk about ownership again. I told you earlier that Colonel Avery was passing ownership down through the generations. But after the Civil War, the land was sold to a man named David Franklin, and it says that he sold the land to cover back taxes. Well, Franklin's idea was to farm the area, make a little money off the land. Now, I don't want to say that was a dumb idea, but the gorge is in the mountains, and mountains are made out of rock. And the gorge itself is made out of steep cliffs. And so that doesn't leave a lot of options for tobacco fields and cow pastures. Well, eventually, this guy Franklin, he figured out that it wasn't going to work. And so he traded the land. And the story is that he traded the land in the Linville Gorge for a brand new suit. Now, I don't know if that's a tall tale or if there's any documentation of that, but that's the story. But eventually, a guy named F.W. Hosefield became the owner of the Linville area. And he knew right away that this place wasn't no good for farming. But he did want to make some return on his investment. And so he made it into a tourist attraction. For a small fee, you could go out there and take a look at Linville Falls. Now keep in mind, I'm just going through the history of it. I'm going to talk more about Linville Falls here in a little bit. But anyway, there is one final sale. In 1952, a man that you might have heard of buys the land around Linville. And his name was John D Rockefeller Jr. But he also didn't keep the land for very long. You see, Rockefeller was a businessman. I don't think he cared a whole lot about the woods. But even though I say he's a businessman, he just gives this land to North Carolina. Well, then North Carolina turns around and they give it to the federal government. And what's kind of ironic is it looks like nobody really wants this land. They keep selling it or giving it away. But you know who did want the land? The Native Americans that you kicked out of there in the first place. Anyway, the federal government splits the land up into two sections. The upper part, which contains Linville Falls, went under the management of the National Park Service, and it became part of the Blue Ridge Parkway. The lower section was designated a wilderness area in 1964, and it was named the Linville Gorge Wilderness Area. And it's taken care of by the U.S. Forest Service. And that's how ownership remains today. Now let's start picking apart the Linville Gorge. And we're going to start with the reason the gorge exists in the first place, and that's the Linville River. So the Linville River starts on Peak Mountain, Sugar Mountain, and Flat Top Mountain. And this is an area they call Linville Gap or Tynecastle. From there, the river goes south, and it goes through Grandfather, Linville, Pinola or Pineola, I'm not sure, Crossnore, and finally Linville Falls, which are all communities in Avery County. Now there is the Linville Falls Waterfall, but this is a community of Linville Falls. Anyway, once the river passes through the community of Linville Falls, it goes into Burke County. and this is where it goes into the Linville Gorge. And it goes all the way down through the middle of the Linville Gorge, and about 30 miles later, the Linville River dumps into the Catawba River. Well, it used to anyway. That area where these two rivers come together, it was flooded in 1923 when they built Lake James. Now let's talk about the waterfall. Linville Falls is actually 3 waterfalls. So the river splits around a rock formation in the middle of the river, and it forms two smaller waterfalls that converge in a little pool. Well, I say a little pool, it's a sizable lagoon there. But then the river seems to vanish out of sight behind another rock formation. But that's the unique thing about Linville Falls. It isn't your typical looking cascade where the water just flows over a cliff. What you can't see from the viewing area where you're looking at those twin waterfalls is a really high capacity 45-foot waterfall on the other side of that rock formation. And that's the big waterfall you'll see if you Google Linville Falls, and I'll have pictures of it in the show notes. Now there's 3 trails where you can go and see the waterfalls, and I've been on all of them. One is a half-mile long, and it's called the Upper Falls Trail, and it leads to the top of the waterfall, and that's where you can see those twin waterfalls that are dropping into that lagoon, and where the main river seems to disappear. Another trail is called Irwin's View Trail, and on this trail there's 2 overlooks. One is at 0.7 miles, and that's called the Chimney View, and the other one is Irwin's View at 0.8 miles. And both of these, you can kind of see the Linville Falls from a distance. It's not a huge distance, but you can kind of get a scope of the main, when I say Linville Falls this time, you can kind of get a scope of the main waterfall, that 45-foot drop. Then you got the Plunge Basin Trail. It's on the other side of the river, and it's a half-mile long. And again, you can kind of get a view of the 45-foot waterfall from there. And I think I said 3 trails. I guess technically it's 4 trails because there's a trail that forks off that Plunge Basin Trail. And it's called the Gorge Trail. It's 0.7 miles long, and it's the best and the worst trail out there. And I'll tell you why in just a second. But this Gorge Trail, it takes you up and over part of the mountain, and it ends down on the Limbo River at the base of the waterfall. Now, like I said, it's only 0.7 miles. When I hiked it, it seemed farther than that, but for me, it was a hard 0.7 miles. Because you see, when you first fork off that Plunge Basin Trail, the trail looks pretty good, but as you go along, and it might have changed over the years. It's been a while since I was out there on that side anyway. But as you're going along, some of the trail isn't much bigger than a rabbit trail. And in some parts of it, you're climbing hand and foot over rocks. And I wouldn't say it's a dangerous trail, but it's really tedious getting down this trail, especially as you're going down toward the river. But when you get down there, it's incredibly serene. And the reason is there's not a whole lot of people down there, maybe because that trail is a little difficult, or because the other viewing areas are fairly easy to get to. And you can see some of the other viewing areas from down on the river, but they're pretty far away. And since there's not a whole lot of people down here, there's not a whole lot of people taking selfies or Instagram pictures of stacked up rocks for no reason at all. In fact, the area when you get down there probably looks and feels like it did 1,000 years ago. So even though I say that trail was the worst, the feeling you get when you're down here in the bottom of Linville Gorge, it makes it the best. Now I'll moan and groan and complain, but if I had a chance right now to do it again, I'd be halfway down that trail already. All right, now let's focus on the crown jewel of the Blue Ridge, the Linville Gorge. Now just to recap, the molten rock turns into Precambrian granitite quartzites, the river erodes everything away, and what's left is the quartzites. Now, a lot of articles call it the Grand Canyon of the East or the Grand Canyon of North Carolina, but just recently for this episode, I read an article that was written last year by a lady named Vicki Reddish. And in that article, she refers to the Linville Gorge as the crown jewel of the Blue Ridge. Now, I don't know if she came up with that moniker, but I loved it. I think it fit better than anything else I've read. In fact, I loved it so much, I decided to use it for the title of this episode. Now, Linville Gorge and the Linville River through the gorge is enclosed by 2 mountains, the Jonas Ridge on the east and Linville Mountain on the west. And the river is about 1,500 to 2,000 feet below the tops of the mountains. Up along the ridge, you can hike Table Rock Mountain, Hawksbill Mountain, Short Off Mountain, or a trail called the Chimneys. Now, I've seen all these mountains from a place called Wiseman's View. but I've never actually hiked over to them. Wiseman's View is the only one I've really been to. And Wiseman's View, it's off Kistler Memorial Highway. Now it says highway, and it is, but it's actually a dirt road that's 9 miles long. And it goes along the top of the gorge. And I'm sure they do their best to keep this road in good shape, but it's on the top of a mountain. It's pretty rough. Now I've done it 2 or 3 times in a Toyota Corolla, but ideally if you're going to go down this Kistler Memorial Highway, you really need a truck or a Jeep because the rain washes it out. So there's these deep ditches just washed out all along this road. But if you can make it to Wiseman's View, it's totally worth it. So when you get to Wiseman's View, you can park in this little gravel parking area, and it's a short trail that goes out to the viewing area. And it's kind of a ledge hanging off the mountain. Once you go out here, you can kind of see all the way across the gorge to Hawksbill Mountain, and you can look left and right and see not the whole gorge, but you can kind of see the length of the gorge there. But there's this weird thing that happens to me every time I go up there, and maybe it happens to everybody. But even though I know exactly what I'm going to see when I go out to Wiseman's View, once I step out there onto that ledge and see the vast expanse of Linville Gorge, it's still this almost scary, jarring feeling. It's hard to describe, but it's pretty shocking. Even though you know exactly what you're about to see, it still gets me every time. It's almost like my brain and my heart can't really get used to what I'm looking at. And speaking of brain and heart, another thing that happens when I go out there is you can see all the way across this thing, and it almost doesn't look real. And I have a theory on that. I've talked to my wife about it. I think that your eyes are just taking in so much optical stimulus that your brain can't even handle it. And again, it's hard to describe if you hadn't been there and seen it. Now, I'm from the Piedmont. Most of you are from North Carolina. Unless you're in the mountains, there's not a whole lot of places where you can see that far and that much at one time. So again, maybe the fact of the matter is I'm just not used to it. But here's one thing I do know. The Linville Gorge is one of the most amazing natural wonders that I've ever seen. And that's pretty much the end of my Linville Gorge episode. Now, some honorable mentions, I suppose you could say. Down in the bottom of the gorge, there's a place called Daffodil Flats. I've never personally been there. You gotta hike down into the gorge to get there. But Daffodil Flats, what I've read about it, is supposedly there used to be an old home place down there, and the people that owned the home planted all these daffodils. Well, the home is gone now. There's no evidence of it. But what's left, and I'll post a picture in the show notes, but what's left is this field in the bottom of the gorge of daffodils. And the pictures look really pretty, but I'm sure the hike is also kind of intense. Another thing, outside of Linville Gorge proper is Linville Caverns. And I have been there. I didn't cover it in this episode because I want to cover some other caves in North Carolina, probably put them all together. But if you ever go up to Linville Gorge and you have time and you're not claustrophobic, I would definitely recommend checking out Linville Caverns. And some of you know about the mysterious Brown Mountain lights. Again, I'm going to cover them in probably their own episode. But Brown Mountain isn't too far from Linville Gorge. And again, I've never seen the Brown Mountain lights, but I've heard that the Linville Gorge is a really good place to view them from. And that's all I got for Linville Gorge. I can't tell you how much I love the place. A little 15-20 minute episode really doesn't do it justice. But you can head over to www.thenceverythingpodcast.com or click the link in the description below, and that'll take you to the show notes, and you can look at some pictures of Linville Gorge. If you have any ideas or suggestions for episodes, you can contact me through the website or the link below, and shoot me an email and give me your ideas, or just say hello, tell me what you think about the show. And if you're interested, you can join the Facebook group. I'll have a link for that below. Or you can search the NC Everything Podcast on Facebook. And there, I post North Carolina related articles and stuff like that. And it's just a place where we can all kind of get together and share our love for North Carolina. And lastly, if you want to support the show, the best way to do that is to subscribe, rate, and review. Now it's getting on about 7:30 in the morning. I'm ready to go get some breakfast. So you guys have a good week, and I'll talk to you next time.